A black woman stood on the tarmac staring in disbelief as the pilot blocked her path to the jet. His arms were crossed, his expression firm, his stance unwavering. There was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. "This flight isn't for you," he said coldly, shaking his head. The woman, dressed in a sharp designer suit, took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She had dealt with assumptions like this before, but this was different. She looked the pilot directly in the eyes and spoke with quiet authority. "This is my jet." The pilot scoffed, letting out a short, amused laugh. "Nice try. Step away." But she didn't move. She didn't have to, because the truth was about to change everything. You won't believe what happens next. What did the pilot assume, and why was he fired on the spot? Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more gripping real-life stories. This story isn't just about one flight, it's about race, privilege, and injustice. A powerful, successful black woman faces an outrageous act of racism, until justice is served in a way no one saw coming. Maya Brooks remained still, her eyes locked onto the pilot who had just dismissed her as if she were a stranger trespassing on restricted grounds. The tension in the air was palpable. The soft hum of jet engines filled the background, but the silence between Maya and the pilot felt louder. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the private tarmac at a Los Angeles airport. The sleek Gulfstream G650 stood before her, its glossy exterior reflecting the sunset's warm glow. It was a symbol of her success, a testament to the years of relentless work she had put into building her tech empire. But even now, as one of the most influential businesswomen in the country, she was still being questioned about whether she belonged. Maya had spent her life breaking barriers. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood, she had climbed her way to the top, founding one of the most successful AI-driven cybersecurity firms in the country. Her intelligence, resilience, and vision had not only earned her immense wealth but also a reputation as a fierce, ethical leader. Despite her accomplishments, she remained deeply connected to her roots, often using her wealth to uplift underserved communities through philanthropy. She stood tall, exuding quiet confidence in a tailored navy blue business suit, her heels clicking lightly against the concrete. Her dark brown skin glowed under the fading sunlight, and her natural curls framed her face elegantly. She was a woman who commanded respect, not because of arrogance, but because she had earned every bit of it. And yet, the pilot before her refused to see her for who she was. Captain Richard Wells had been flying private jets for over 30 years. His crisp white uniform was pressed to perfection, his silver pilot wings gleaming against his chest. With graying hair and a tall, imposing build, he carried himself with an air of authority. He had flown some of the richest people in the world, from Hollywood elites to CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. But in all his years, he had never seen a black woman step onto a private jet like she owned it. And in his mind, that meant she didn't belong. His assumptions were immediate. As soon as Maya had approached the jet, he barely spared her a glance before shifting his attention to the other crew members. He had already made up his mind about her. She was probably the assistant of some wealthy businessman, or maybe even a social media influencer looking for a last-minute ride. But the owner? Not a chance. Richard spoke in a clipped, dismissive tone, his gaze flickering between Maya and the flight crew. "Who's in charge of this flight's clearance?" he asked, completely ignoring her presence. One of the flight attendants hesitated before nodding toward Maya. "Sir, she is." Richard turned back to Maya, his frown deepening. His expression was laced with skepticism. He still wasn't convinced. In his world, people like Maya didn't own private jets. They weren't the Maya Brooks. They were a mistake, a misunderstanding, an error to be corrected. Maya noticed the subtle frown on his face the moment she had approached. She'd seen it before. The quiet disbelief, the narrowing of the eyes, the quick assessment people made before realizing who she was. But this time was different. This wasn't a waiter ignoring her at an upscale restaurant or a car salesman assuming she couldn't afford the luxury vehicle she was test driving. This was her own pilot, denying her access to what she owned. The golden light of the setting sun did nothing to soften the tension between them. The silence stretched long enough for Maya to hear the distant chatter of airport workers, the occasional hum of another private jet taking off in the background. She took a step forward, her voice firm yet measured. "I believe there's a misunderstanding," she said, looking directly at the pilot. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. There was no misunderstanding, not in his mind. And what happened next would make that painfully clear. Maya took a step forward, maintaining eye contact with Captain Richard Wells. Her posture was steady, her confidence unwavering. The setting sun reflected off the smooth exterior of the jet, casting long shadows on the tarmac. A gust of wind swept across the runway, ruffling the edges of her blazer. She had dealt with moments like this before. People assuming she didn't belong, questioning her presence in spaces she had earned her way into. But never had someone directly blocked her from stepping into something she owned. As she moved toward the jet's stairs, Richard suddenly stepped in front of her, blocking her path entirely. His presence was imposing, his stance deliberate. He wasn't just asking her to stop, he was making it clear that he believed she had no right to be there. "Miss," Richard said, his voice laced with thinly veiled condescension, "I think you might be confused. This is a private jet." Maya blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Was he serious? She glanced around, half expecting a member of her flight crew to correct him. But they all remained silent, unsure of how to intervene. "I know," she responded evenly. "I own it." Richard let out a sharp, mocking laugh, shaking his head as if he had just heard the most ridiculous statement of the day. He crossed his arms and smirked. "Right," he scoffed, still chuckling, "and I'm the president." Maya's jaw tightened. She had no patience for this, not today. Richard, still unconvinced, turned his back to her and addressed the flight crew instead. "Who authorized this? Who let her through security?" His voice was louder now, commanding attention. A few bystanders, airport workers and other private jet passengers, had started to notice the commotion, their eyes darting toward Maya and the pilot. Maya exhaled slowly, trying to suppress the frustration bubbling inside her. She had encountered prejudice in many forms, subtle, disguised, polite, but this was blatant disrespect. "I don't need authorization," she stated firmly, her voice cutting through the tense air. "I have the ownership documents right here." She pulled her phone from her purse, ready to show proof if necessary. But Richard barely glanced at her. He waved his hand dismissively as if she wasn't worth acknowledging. "That won't be necessary," he said flatly. "I already know what's happening here." Maya's eyes narrowed. "Oh? And what exactly is happening?" Richard sighed as if he were being forced to explain something painfully obvious. "Miss, this jet belongs to Maya Brooks." Maya raised an eyebrow. Yes, it does. Richard's smirk returned. Then where is she? Maya couldn't believe what she was hearing. She took a step closer, her voice unwavering. I am Maya Brooks. A brief flicker of something, uncertainty, hesitation, flashed across Richard's face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. His mind was already made up. I've flown plenty of high-profile clients, he said with a smug tone. And trust me, you don't fit the profile. Maya inhaled sharply, her fists clenching at her sides. She wasn't just being denied her own flight, she was being erased from her own success. The tension around them was palpable now. Airport staff and passengers had stopped to watch. Some exchanged confused glances, while others whispered among themselves. The murmurs grew louder, the weight of the situation sinking in. Maya lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. I am the owner of this aircraft. I am the CEO of Brooks Tech, and you are standing between me and my jet. Richard's expression remained unfazed. He took a step back, placing his hands on his hips. Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this isn't happening. Maya opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, 2 airport security guards approached. They walked with purpose, their gazes shifting between Richard and Maya. What's the issue here? One of them asked. Richard gestured toward Maya without hesitation. This woman is trying to board a private flight she doesn't belong on. Maya's eyes burned with frustration, but she remained composed. She had dealt with situations like this her entire life. But today, she wasn't just going to walk away. One of the guards turned to her. Miss, do you have any identification? Maya nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around her phone. This should have never been necessary, but she knew exactly what was happening. Richard, however, had already made his decision. He shook his head and turned to the flight crew with finality. Get her off my runway. The words echoed in the air, carried by the hush that had fallen over the crowd. The hostility in his voice was unmistakable. And in that moment, Maya knew. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was about power, perception, and a system that had tried to keep her out. But Richard had no idea who he was dealing with. Maya stood her ground, her sharp gaze fixed on Richard. The tension in the air was suffocating, pressing down on everyone who had stopped to watch the scene unfold. The security guards remained on standby, unsure whether they should intervene further. The onlookers whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between the woman in the designer suit and the man in the crisp pilot uniform. The weight of the moment was undeniable. But Maya had had enough. I don't need your permission, she said, her voice unwavering. I'm stepping onto my jet. She moved forward, but Richard immediately stepped in her path again, this time standing even taller, his arms crossed over his chest like a gatekeeper blocking access to something she had no right to claim. His expression hardened, his lips curling into a condescending smirk. Listen, he said, his voice slow and deliberate as if speaking to a child. I don't care who you think you are, but I'm not flying some random woman around just because she claims she's rich. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had formed. A few people exchanged looks of shock while others murmured in disbelief. But Richard didn't flinch. He didn't see anything wrong with what he had said. Maya clenched her jaw. She had heard words like this before, heard them spoken in boardrooms, at high-end restaurants, at luxury car dealerships, but never had. They'd been used to deny her something that was rightfully hers. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. Anger wouldn't get her anywhere. Facts would. "I don't need to prove myself to you," she said, pulling out her phone. "But since you clearly have trouble understanding, let's make this simple." She tapped a quick message to her assistant, then lifted her head, her eyes still locked onto Richard. "I'd like to see the flight manifest," she said. Richard let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, please." He waved her off as if she were some nuisance. "This flight is for Amaya Brooks, not you." Maya's lips parted slightly, a short laugh escaping her throat. She tilted her head, incredulous. He wasn't even trying to hide it now. "You're joking," she said, raising an eyebrow. "You really think I just guessed the name of the person who owns this jet?" Richard's smirk didn't fade. "Wouldn't be the first time someone tried to pull a stunt like this." Maya exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers against her temple. This wasn't just arrogance, it was pure ignorance. At that moment, a sleek black car pulled up near the edge of the tarmac. The passenger door swung open, and a well-dressed woman stepped out hurriedly. Sophie Langley, Maya's personal assistant, practically ran toward the scene, her heels clicking against the pavement. Sophie's eyes widened in disbelief as she took in the situation. Maya standing in front of the jet, her access denied, and a cocky-looking pilot standing in her way. She skidded to a halt beside Maya, slightly out of breath. "What is going on?" Sophie asked, looking between Maya and Richard. Maya crossed her arms. "Apparently, I don't exist." Sophie's expression twisted in confusion. "What?" Richard sighed, looking bored now. "This lady here claims she's Maya Brooks, but I happen to know that the real Maya Brooks—" He paused, glancing at Sophie. "Doesn't look like this." Sophie blinked. Her jaw went slack. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then she let out an actual laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You cannot be serious," she said, turning to Richard. "You really think this woman," she gestured at Maya, "this internationally recognized CEO, this tech mogul, this self-made millionaire, is pretending to be Maya Brooks?" Richard shrugged, still unconvinced. "That's exactly what I think." Maya had had enough. Without another word, she reached into her purse and pulled out her passport, her official ID, and a copy of the jet's ownership papers. She handed them to Sophie, who immediately flipped them open and turned to the closest security guard. "I want you to verify these right now," Sophie ordered, her voice sharp and authoritative. The security guard hesitated, then took the documents and stepped aside to make a call. Meanwhile, Maya pulled up an email on her phone and turned the screen toward Richard. "This is the official bill of sale for the jet," she said. "Do you need me to spell my name out for you?" Richard's smirk finally wavered. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face, but still he refused to back down. "I'll believe it when I see it," he muttered. At that moment, the security guard returned. He was no longer hesitant. He looked pale, his eyes flickering between the documents and Maya. His hands trembled slightly as he handed the passport and papers back. "She's telling the truth," the guard said, his voice quiet. "This jet belongs to Miss Maya Brooks." Silence. A few gasps rippled through the bystanders. Some of the flight crew shifted uncomfortably. The realization hit all at once. They had all just witnessed a massive mistake unfold in real time. Richard's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes darted from the security guard to Maya, then to the official. Paperwork now being passed around. Then, one of the flight crew members, a young co-pilot who had been standing to the side the entire time, gasped. "Oh my God," he murmured under his breath, staring at the manifest. His hands were shaking as he quickly flipped through the papers. His gaze snapped up to Richard, and the horror was evident in his eyes. "Sir," the co-pilot said hesitantly, his voice thick with nerves. She's really Maya Brooks." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The truth had finally caught up to him. The weight of the moment settled like a thick cloud over the tarmac. The once confident Richard Wells stood frozen, his posture stiff, his lips slightly parted as if he were trying to form words, but failing. The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder, rippling like a wave of realization spreading through the small crowd. The young co-pilot, his face pale, flipped through the pages of the flight manifest again, double-checking as if hoping he had made a mistake, but the truth was there, staring back at him. His hands trembled as he turned to Richard and whispered urgently, his voice barely audible over the growing noise around them. "Sir, she owns this jet." Richard blinked rapidly, his confidence crumbling in an instant. His eyes darted from the co-pilot to Maya, then back to the manifest in the younger man's hands. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, as if still trying to process what he had just heard. The murmurs swelled into a hushed commotion as the truth spread. Maya Brooks was not some random woman trying to sneak onto a private jet. She was the Maya Brooks, the woman whose name was on the official documents, the one paying for this entire flight, the one standing before them with more dignity and patience than Richard had ever deserved. At that moment, the airport manager arrived, flanked by 2 additional security personnel. His eyes swept over the scene, immediately sensing the tension. One glance at the manifest, the ownership papers, and Maya's identification, and it was clear what had happened. His gaze hardened as he turned to Richard. "Captain Wells," the manager said, his voice clipped and professional, "is there a reason you've been refusing to let Miss Brooks board her own aircraft?" Richard stammered, struggling to find the right words. I just assumed—" He stopped abruptly, as if realizing there was no justifiable way to finish that sentence. Maya remained silent, watching him with the same unwavering composure she had maintained from the start. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was speaking for itself now. Sophie, Maya's assistant, stepped forward, arms crossed, shaking her head in disbelief. Her voice cut through the awkward silence like a blade. "Maybe now you'll listen," she said, her tone laced with sharp disappointment. "Miss Brooks is your employer." Richard's face turned ghostly pale. His shoulders slumped, and, for the first time since their confrontation began, he looked genuinely afraid. The tension on the tarmac was thick, but it wasn't just Richard who felt the weight of it. Other airport staff exchanged nervous glances, clearly embarrassed that they had allowed the situation to escalate this far. Then came a loud click. A journalist who had been in the private terminal preparing for another assignment had caught the entire ordeal on camera. He lowered his lens and glanced at the screen, his eyebrows raising as he reviewed the shots he had just taken. "Wow," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "This is going to be news." Richard heard the click, turned sharply and saw the camera. His expression shifted from humiliation to sheer panic. He had made a critical mistake, and now it was public. Before he could even think of a way to salvage what little was left of his reputation, a black luxury car pulled up nearby. The door swung open, and out stepped a tall, distinguished man in a navy blue suit, the owner of the airline. His face was unreadable as he walked toward the scene, his gaze briefly locking onto Maya before landing on Richard. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard swallowed hard. He knew what was coming. The airline owner stopped in front of Richard, his stance commanding, his voice calm but firm. "We don't tolerate discrimination here," he said without hesitation. "Pack your things." The words hit like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom. The finality of them left no room for argument. Richard inhaled sharply, his mouth opening slightly as if to protest, but no words came out. He looked around wildly as if hoping for someone to intervene on his behalf. But the only thing he saw was the quiet, burning disappointment in every pair of eyes watching him. A security officer stepped forward. "Captain Wells, please step away from the aircraft." The defeated man had no choice. He nodded slowly, his face blank, his once proud stance now reduced to a slow, reluctant shuffle as he turned and walked toward the terminal. Maya watched as he left, her expression unreadable. She hadn't needed to fight him with anger or raised voices. The truth had done all the work for her. As the tension on the tarmac finally began to ease, Maya let out a slow, measured breath. Justice had been served, but there was still more to be said, and she intended to say it. Richard Wells walked away from the jet, his shoulders slumped, his polished shoes scraping against the tarmac as he dragged himself toward the terminal. The air around him felt thick with shame, and each step seemed heavier than the last. The weight of the crowd's silent judgment pressed down on him. His career, his reputation, everything he had built over 3 decades of flying high-profile clients was gone in an instant. But just as he reached the security checkpoint, something made him stop. A moment of hesitation. A final, desperate attempt to salvage what was left. He turned back to face Maya. His face was pale, his lips trembling slightly. His once proud posture had crumbled into uncertainty. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes searched Maya's for something. Understanding, forgiveness, an ounce of sympathy. Maya stood in the same spot where the confrontation had begun, her expression composed, her hands clasped together in front of her. There was no rage, no gloating, just quiet strength. Her gaze met his, steady and unwavering. When she spoke, her words were calm but powerful. "You didn't want to know." Richard swallowed hard. He wanted to protest, to explain himself, to somehow justify the way he had treated her. But what excuse could he give? That he had assumed she was lying? That he had believed his own biases more than her own words? There was nothing left to say. One of the security officers gave Richard a firm nod. "Let's go." And just like that, Richard was escorted away, his career ending the same way it had thrived, on the tarmac. Maya let out a quiet breath as she watched him disappear into the terminal. The moment wasn't about him anymore. She turned to the flight crew, the bystanders, the airport staff, and the security team, all of whom had just witnessed the consequences of racial bias unfolding in real time. The air was still thick with tension, but now it held something else. Reflection. Maya's voice rang out, clear and firm. "Let this be a lesson," she said, making sure everyone could hear her. "Don't judge people based on their skin color." The silence that followed was deep, almost deafening. The reality of what had just happened sank in for everyone. A young black woman standing near the airport fence who had been watching the entire ordeal nodded slowly. There was something in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement, a sense of being seen. Maya turned to the crew, now standing at full attention, their faces unreadable. Without another word, she adjusted her blazer, lifted her chin, and walked up the jet's steps. The door closed behind her. For a moment, everything was still, but outside, the world was already talking. By the time Maya's jet was airborne, the story had already begun to spread. Passengers at the airport had taken photos, journalists had recorded snippets of the argument, and the image of Richard Wells being fired on the tarmac was circulating online. Within hours, the incident became the top trending topic on social media. Justice for Maya. She, racism. In the sky. She owns the jet people shared the story worldwide, shocked by the blatant discrimination and inspired by Maya's composure. The footage of her calmly correcting Richard, of her powerful words that left him speechless, was replayed again and again. News outlets covered it extensively. Articles were written about racism in elite spaces, the stereotypes surrounding black wealth, and the quiet but undeniable obstacles that even the most successful people of color still faced. The video was an awakening. For some, a confirmation of what they had known all along. For others, a moment of reflection on their own biases. Maya's name was already known in the business world, but now she became something more. She became a symbol of resilience, proof that success wasn't limited to any one race. Celebrities, activists, and CEOs spoke out in support of her. Other high-profile figures shared their own stories of racial bias. The world was listening. Maya, however, didn't just let the moment pass. Instead of using the attention for personal gain, she used it to amplify a message that needed to be heard. She issued a statement, not just about her own experience, but about the countless others who didn't have a platform to speak on. How many times has this happened to someone without cameras around? She wrote in a viral post. How many people have been turned away from spaces they rightfully belong in? How many moments of injustice have gone unseen? We don't just need awareness. We need change. Her words resonated across industries. Companies began reevaluating their diversity training. Airline executives issued new policies to prevent racial profiling. Public figures pledged to take action, calling out discrimination wherever they saw it. And, most importantly, people who had felt invisible for so long finally felt seen. Maya's response wasn't about anger, it was about impact. She had been humiliated, dismissed, and nearly denied her own success. But in the end, she had turned that moment into something bigger than herself. Her message was clear. You belong in every space you work for. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. For young black professionals, for entrepreneurs breaking barriers, for women challenging expectations, her story became more than a viral moment. It became a movement, and as her jet soared higher into the sky, leaving behind the airport where she had just faced open discrimination, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just flying above the clouds. She was rising above every doubt, every assumption, every limitation that had ever been placed in her way, and she wasn't coming down anytime soon. As Maya's jet soared through the sky, leaving behind the painful but powerful lesson on the Tarmac. She gazed out of the window, watching the world stretch endlessly beneath her. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. She had walked onto that tarmac as a woman with power, success, and influence. And yet, in the eyes of one man, none of that had mattered, simply because of her skin color. But the truth had prevailed. Judging someone based on their appearance will always leave you blind to the truth. Now, Maya's story was out in the world, sparking conversations, inspiring change, and challenging deep-seated biases. But the real question remains. What would you have done in Maya's place? Would you have remained calm? Would you have fought back? Or would you have walked away? Let us know in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge perceptions and spark change. Your voice matters in conversations like these, and together we can make a difference. And this is just the beginning. Stay tuned for another inspiring tale coming soon, because the fight for justice never stops, and neither do we.